Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the very unglamorous reality of staying alive in a tipi while the plains try to turn you into a human icicle. From warming your house with buffalo dung to sleeping cheek to jowl with half your family and the occasional dog, to learning that snowed the same stuff trying to kill you was also stuffed against your walls as insulation. Survival was never cozy, but it was brilliant. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy falling asleep to obscure history explained with a little sarcasm. Otherwise, just stay for the buffalo dung. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine this story being heard at midnight in one place and over breakfast in another. Now, lower the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, or let the hum of your heater remind you what luxury really is, and let's step quietly into the winter plains together. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, and brace yourself, because you weren't about to spend your childhood tucked under a heated blanket, scrolling through endless distractions, complaining about the thermostat being set to 20 instead of 22. No. You would have been born into the kind of winter where stepping outside felt less like fresh air and more like volunteering to be slapped repeatedly by the hand of God. Plains winters weren't gentle. They were endless, teeth-chattering sermons in negative temperatures, with winds so sharp they could probably circumcise you without asking. Imagine it. No walls, no bricks, no double-glazed windows humming with artificial heat. Just a treeless horizon, blizzards rolling in like bored armies. And you small, hungry, and expected to survive inside a portable house made of sticks and dead animals. Welcome to the Great Plains, where the weather had no interest in your personal comfort, and where winter was basically a 6-month audition for frostbite. If you'd been unlucky enough to be born there, the first thing you'd notice was that the cold wasn't something outside. It was a resident. It crept through your nostrils, camped in your lungs, and tucked itself into your bones like an unwelcome tenant. It wasn't, oh, I should put on a sweater. It was, if I don't do this right, I won't wake up tomorrow. Survival wasn't seasonal, it was hourly. And yet, strangely enough, people did more than survive. They thrived, which is the part modern minds tend to choke on. Because if you even so much as lose Wi-Fi in winter, you think civilization is collapsing. But they, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Blackfoot, went through storms with names like the one that froze the horses standing and somehow emerged the next morning alive, sometimes even laughing. So, how did they manage? Well, first you'd have to understand that the plains themselves were both executioner and provider. The same buffalo herds that fed you in summer also clothed you in winter. You wouldn't be running to IKEA for insulation or Amazon for thermal socks. You'd be skinning animals, stretching hides, sewing with sinew until your fingers cracked, because that was the difference between life and a body the wind could rattle through. The cold shaped everything, the way you ate, the way you built shelter, even the way you slept, especially the way you slept, because nighttime wasn't rest, it was negotiation with death. You closed your eyes only if you were confident your fire would hold, your hides wouldn't stiffen, and your family would keep breathing till dawn. You didn't crawl under the covers. You burrowed into them like an animal, because deep down you knew you were just another creature trying not to freeze on an open plain. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Winter was never just weather. It was a ritual. The land tested you, stripped you down, and asked if you still deserved to be here. And if you said yes by building smarter, eating tougher, and enduring longer, you'd get another sunrise. If not, well, the plains didn't exactly hand out second chances. So, before we talk about how you actually managed to sleep in a tipi without freezing to death, you need to know this. Every single night was a gamble. A calculated risk against winds that could scour the earth, against snow that fell so heavy it erased trails, against a horizon that never looked sorry for trying to kill you. And somehow, instead of curling into despair, people learned to build shelters that didn't just resist the cold, they used it. Which brings us, naturally, to the shape of the shelter itself. That strange conical skeleton of poles and hides that looked like it had been designed more for ceremony than survival. And yet, well, let's save that revelation for a moment. Now, let's talk about the shelter itself. Tipi. At first glance you might think, really, that's it? A cone made of sticks and hides. That's supposed to keep me from freezing solid. And yes, it looks deceptively simple. like a child's sketch of a house triangle with a door butt underneath. That geometry was an engineering trick that kept people alive in temperatures that would make modern city dwellers cry over frozen windscreen wipers. If you had been born onto those endless plains, the tipi wasn't just your house. It was your womb, your heater, your oxygen regulator, your smoke chimney, and your daily physics lesson all rolled into one. It's very shaped, conical, aerodynamic and just aesthetic. It was survival with style. You know how modern architects obsess over sustainability. The tipi had that solved centuries ago. Picture this: icy wind barreling across flatland with nothing to stop it. If you'd built yourself a square house like some clueless settler, it would have collected drafts like a bad office cubicle. But the tipi, its cone-shaped body sliced the wind, let snow slide off, and made sure gusts didn't catch and rip it apart. It was less wall and more deflector shield, with hides stretched so tightly they hummed like drumskin in the wind. And here's the cleverest part: ventilation. You'd think trapping heat would be the only goal, but fire was your lifeline, and fire produces smoke, lots of it, enough to choke you out faster than the cold would. The top of the tipi had smoke flaps, adjustable wings you could move with poles, like the original smart thermostat. Close them against wind, open them for airflow, tilt them just right so the smoke swirled up and out instead of spiraling back into your lungs. Primitive, maybe, effective, always. Inside, it worked like a natural convection oven. The air near the fire stayed warm and circulated upward, while the sloping walls funneled smoke away. Heat collected low where you slept, while smoke escaped high where it wouldn't suffocate you. If you've ever lived in a modern house where the heating never quite makes it to the upstairs bedroom, you'll understand just how radical that balance was. And don't think of the tipi as fragile. Those lodgepole pine frames, sometimes 30 feet long, were tough, stripped, and carefully chosen. Hides layered over them were stitched with sinew, not just thrown on like a tarp. In winter, extra hides could be added, or grass mats stuffed in between for insulation. The whole thing was transportable, yes, but also shockingly durable. Settlers often built wooden cabins and froze anyway. Meanwhile, tipis stayed warm, mobile, and weatherproof because their design was built on generations of trial, error, and sheer stubbornness against the elements. But maybe the most eerie part is this: the tipi wasn't just practical, it was cosmological. To live inside it was to live inside a symbol. The conical shape mirrored the universe itself, with the fire at the center as the axis of life. Your daily struggle against the wind wasn't just survival, it was a reenactment of cosmic balance. Every adjustment of the flaps, every hide stretched tight, every ember glowing in the middle was more than home maintenance. It was order against chaos, warmth against the abyss, fire against the winter that never loved you back. So, yes, if you had been there, you'd crawl inside that triangular silhouette each night, not just to survive, but to live inside a design perfected for both body and spirit. And the moment the wind howled outside, you'd thank every ancestor who realized cones, not cubes, keep humans alive. And yet, the shape was only part of the story. The real miracle lay in the stuff it was made from: the hides, the mats, the layers of insulation that turned dead animals into life-saving architecture. If you had been born onto those plains, you'd learn very quickly that your life depended not on brick or mortar, but on bones, hides, and trees dragged from miles away. The tipi wasn't some abstract design waiting for materials. It was a body stitched together from the plains themselves. And every part of it had to earn its place, because if one piece failed, so did you. First, the skeleton, lodgepole pine, long, straight, and flexible enough not to snap when the wind decided to test your mortality. Trouble is, lodgepole pine doesn't exactly grow in the treeless heart of the plains. No, you'd have to haul it sometimes hundreds of miles from the Rockies or other forests. Imagine dragging 30-foot poles by horse, or before that, by dog and sweat, across endless grassland. That was your moving day, and you thought IKEA furniture was a pain. Then came the skin, buffalo hides. You weren't wrapping your home in cotton or canvas. You were stitching together the bodies of the very animals that kept you alive. It took roughly a dozen to 20 hides to cover a full-size winter tipi. Each one scraped, tanned, softened with brains and smoke, until it was pliable enough to bend, yet thick enough to stop a winter gust dead in its tracks. The smell of smoke and leather would cling to your walls, to your hair, to everything you owned. That wasn't just atmosphere, it was insulation, waterproofing, and mosquito repellent all in one. Later, when trade brought canvas, some tribes adopted it. Lighter, yes, but less insulating. Canvas didn't trap warmth the way buffalo hides did. You'd survive, but you'd miss the muffled heaviness of thick hide walls that felt like sleeping inside the chest of an animal larger than you. And here's something modern minds rarely get. Nothing was wasted. Sinew, those long, tough animal tendons, became thread to stitch the hides. Bones became tools for scraping and sewing. Even the fat played its part, rubbed into leather to keep it supple against the dry, cracking cold. Your house wasn't constructed. It was butchered together, literally. Every time you stepped inside, you were surrounded by the ghosts of the herd, each one a brick in your wall. But materials weren't only hides and poles. Grasses, reeds, and bark found their way into winter tipis too. People wove mats to line the interior, creating an insulating pocket of air between the wall and the lining. Snow, ironically, was also a material. Packed up against the outer base, it formed a natural seal, the same way igloos work, not melting, but insulating, keeping warmth inside. So yes, the very thing threatening to kill you could also save you if you learned to use it. And the eerie brilliance of it all is that this wasn't about luxury, it was about relationship. You didn't just live inside a house, you lived inside the plains, its wood, its grass, its hides. The wind outside wasn't separate from the poles swaying over your head. The buffalo you hunted wasn't separate from the warmth you curled under at night. Every material was a transaction, a negotiation with the land. We take this, we honor this, we survive another night. So if you'd been there, every time you leaned against the wall of your tipi, you'd feel ribs of wood and flesh stitched into shelter. A reminder that survival wasn't about conquering nature, it was about weaving yourself into it. And yet, hides and poles alone wouldn't have kept you warm. The real trick was how you layered and lined that interior, turning what looked like a cone into a furnace. Step inside your winter tipi for a moment. At first, it seems bigger than it should. Dark walls, sloping high above, poles meeting like ribs overhead, fire crackling at the center. But look closely, and you'll notice the real magic isn't just hides and poles. It's the lining, the secret layer of defense that kept you from waking up stiff, blue, and very dead. If you had been there, you wouldn't just live in a cone wrapped in buffalo hides. That was the outer shell, the weather-facing skin. Inside, you'd hang another layer on, in a lining made of hides, woven mats, or sometimes canvas. Think of it as the world's first insulation system, except it didn't come in pink fiberglass rolls that make you itch for 3 days. No, this was breathable, adaptable, and endlessly repairable. That inner liner was everything. It created a pocket of air between itself and the outer wall, a buffer zone that trapped warmth low where people actually lived. Hot air from the fire rose, carrying smoke upward, while the liner pulled cooler drafts down along the sides and out the top vents. It was like someone had built a miniature weather system inside your house, one that worked on nothing but convection and ancestral genius, and the details mattered. The liner didn't stretch all the way to the top. It stopped at about shoulder height, leaving a gap near the ground. That gap let fresh air flow in low, feeding the fire and pushing smoke upward. The result: warmth stayed where you slept, while smoke found its way out. You weren't suffocating in fumes, and you weren't shivering under hides at the same time. The whole system worked because generations had tested it through winters that would kill the careless. Now, add in another trick: mats of reeds, bark, or grasses. These could be wedged between the liner and the outer wall, thickening the insulation for the coldest months. Families even banked snow along the outside base of the tipi, sealing drafts the way you might shove a towel under a leaky door. Snow, the very thing trying to end you, became part of your insulation kit. That's not irony, it's survival sarcasm, delivered by the land itself. And think about the sound. Inside a double-lined snow-banked tipi, the wind outside didn't just blow, it howled, muffled, like some beast raging at the door, but unable to get in. The hides quivered, the poles creaked, and the snow pressed close. But inside it was quieter, warmer, closer. The insulation didn't just hold heat, it held atmosphere. You, wrapped in robes and furs, would have known the difference instantly. Walk into a poorly lined tipi, and the draft nips your ankles, the smoke stings your eyes, the fire struggles. Walk into a properly lined one, and suddenly you're not in a frozen wasteland, you're in a womb of engineered warmth, a circle of life carved out of wind and hide. But here's the kicker. This wasn't luxury, it was mandatory. Without the lining, without the airflow system, without the snowbanks and mats, you'd be found stiff by morning. Insulation wasn't decoration, it was the thin line between family life and a frozen wake. So yes, if you'd been there, you would have learned quickly that the art of warmth wasn't just making fire. It was trapping, guiding, and coaxing that heat into staying with you through the night. And once you had your lined tipi glowing with firelight, there was still one more lifeline to worry about. The fire itself, flickering in the center like the heartbeat of your entire survival. So here you are, wrapped in hides, tucked inside a cone of buffalo skin and pine, double-lined and snow-banked like some prehistoric thermos. Sounds cozy enough, right? Except, without the fire in the middle, you'd still be a human popsicle by dawn. The fire wasn't optional, it was the pulse of the tipi. If it died, you froze. If it flared wrong, you choked. Either way, your night ended badly. Picture the setup, a small pit dug at the center, carefully ringed with stones. Not a roaring bonfire, but a modest, steady flame, just enough to glow. The plains weren't exactly lush with wood, so you wouldn't waste logs pretending you were at a summer camp. You burned what you had, cottonwood, driftwood, sometimes even dried buffalo dung, because necessity doesn't care about your sensibilities. That smoke you wrinkle your nose at. Out there, it was survival perfume. And here's the balancing act: warmth versus suffocation. Too much fire, and the tipi filled with choking smoke until your eyes watered and your lungs begged for mercy. Too little, and you curled tighter into your robes, teeth clattering in unison with the wind outside. That's where the smoke flaps came in, the tipi's built-in respiratory system. Someone always had an eye on them, adjusting poles to angle the flaps against shifting winds, letting just enough draft suck smoke upward without stealing all your heat. It was like operating the world's oldest HVAC system, except it required intuition, muscle, and the occasional curse at the weather gods. The fire did more than heat. It cooked your meals, dried damp hides, sterilized tools, and even warded off spirits, or so you were told while staring into its glow at 3 in the morning. The hearth wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Flames linked the human world to the divine, sparks rising like prayers through the smoke hole into a sky that didn't always feel like it cared. And you slept by it, that glow licking shadows across the tipi walls, your body half warm, half chilled, depending on how far you were from the flames. Families arranged themselves in a circle around the fire, with elders and children in the prime warm spots, others on the perimeter catching the draft. Privacy, forget it. You lived cheek to jowl with the people you depended on most, and the fire in the middle was the referee making sure everyone made it to morning. Maintenance was constant. Someone always got up to stoke the embers, toss in a stick, or shift the coals. Banked the fire too much, and you woke to frost creeping along the hides. Let it flare unchecked, and sparks threatened to eat the walls. Every night was an act of careful management, the same way a pilot handles a fragile instrument panel. You weren't asleep in winter, you were coexisting with fire, half watching it even in your dreams. And maybe that's why so many old stories centered on it. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was character, presence, something alive. You could fall asleep to its crackle, the way people now fall asleep to playlists of fake rain sounds. But unlike rain, the fire could betray you. It could sputter, smoke, or vanish. So if you had been there, curled on buffalo robes, lulled by flames, you'd have known this. The fire wasn't a convenience, it was your heartbeat. And once you understood that, you'd understand why every tipi was built around it. Because without the fire, there was only the cold, and the cold always wanted you more. And yet, even with flames burning steady, you had another enemy to outwit: the wind itself. Endless and merciless, battering at your door. Which is why the way you placed your tipi, its orientation on the plains, mattered almost as much as the fire glowing inside it. Here's something you'd learn fast on the plains. It wasn't enough to have a tipi, a fire, and a heap of buffalo hides. If you pitched it wrong, the wind would peel you open like a badly wrapped present. Placement wasn't random, it was survival strategy. The plains had no patience for mistakes. First, you'd never face the door into the wind. That would be suicide by draft. Instead, entrances were usually set east, catching the morning sun and shielding against the prevailing westerlies that came howling across the horizon like angry creditors. Think of it less as feng shui and more as not freezing to death because you chose the wrong compass point. Wake up with a blast of icy wind in your face just once, and you'd understand why tradition set the rules. And it wasn't just about the door. Camp placement mattered too. Tipis were arranged in circles, forming small windbreaks for each other. A lone tipi, exposed out on the plains, was basically a buffet, offering itself to the elements. But a ring of them, family beside family, hides overlapping, smoke rising together, that created a kind of communal fortress. A village that could weather storms better than any isolated hero could. Sometimes, people even banked their shelters into the land itself, choosing slight rises or depressions where the earth gave a little protection. In deep snow, they'd mound drifts against the base of the walls, sealing the bottom from stray drafts. It looked precarious, like a house being swallowed, but in reality, the snow worked as insulation, plugging gaps and deadening the shriek of the wind. Again, irony as survival. The thing that wanted you dead could also be pressed into service to keep you alive. And orientation wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Facing east meant greeting the sunrise, starting each day in alignment with light and life. The tipi wasn't just a shelter plopped on the ground. It was a compass, a marker of cosmic order. The land wasn't empty. It was directional, alive, demanding that you respect where you placed yourself within it. Now, picture what happened during storms. Winds could batter the walls, snow piling higher, poles creaking like ribs under strain. If you'd been careless, pitched your tipi in a low-lying floodplain, or with the door gaping to the west, you'd wake up buried in drifts or gasping in smoke. But if you'd done it right, you'd hear the storm rage outside, muffled by hides and liners, while inside the fire glowed steady. Placement didn't just affect comfort. It meant the difference between waking up sore and waking up dead. And here's the eerie truth. People knew the wind like you know traffic. Its rhythms, its tricks, its seasonal tantrums. You'd grow up learning how to read the horizon, how to watch the grass bend, how to feel the shift in the air. That said, storm tonight, and you'd pitch accordingly, staking your survival on instinct, tuned across generations. So yes, if you had been born there, you wouldn't have taken shelter placement lightly. You'd never fling up your tent like a careless camper. You'd know that the ground, the wind, and the sun all had votes in whether you lived another night. And once you'd pitched your tipi in the right place, with the right orientation, you'd still have to face the ground beneath you, the frozen earth that waited to leach the warmth from your body the moment you closed your eyes. So you've set up your tipi, pointed the door in the right direction, banked it with snow, and got the fire humming like a heart. Good. Now comes the cruelest part of winter survival, the ground itself. Because if you lay straight on frozen earth, you'd bleed out your heat faster than a rabbit on a butcher's block. Soil doesn't forgive. It steals warmth, bone by bone, until you're shaking yourself awake at dawn, wondering why your teeth sound like castanet. If you'd been born there, you'd never put your body directly on the dirt. The floor of a tipi wasn't barit, was layered. First, evergreen boughs or woven grass mats, thick enough to lift you a few inches above the icy ground. That space mattered. It was insulation, pure and simple. Every twig, every reed, every stitched mat was another barrier between you and the frozen planet, trying to eat you alive. Over that base came hides, buffalo robes, elk skins, later wool trade blankets when they were available. Families layered them thick, sometimes several deep. The best were the winter buffalo robes, heavy with dense fur, soft underneath, thick enough to swallow you whole. You didn't just cover yourself with them. You sank into them like a coffin of warmth. And sleeping wasn't solitary. You'd be pressed shoulder to shoulder with kin, sometimes 3 or 4 to a single pile of robes. Children in the middle, elders close to the fire, younger adults on the edges where drafts slipped through. If you ever complained about sharing a bed in childhood, imagine growing up in a human sandwich, wrapped in fur, with someone's breath hot against the back of your neck and someone else's knee stuck in your ribs. It wasn't comfort, it was survival by proximity. And don't forget, bedding was alive. Not in a metaphorical sense, literally alive. Fleas, lice, and other small companions made those hides their playground. You'd learn quickly that warmth came with a price. Scratching in the night, uninvited crawlers nibbling at your scalp. But hey, better itchy and alive than frozen and clean. The smell was part of the package too. Smoke from the fire, musk from the hides, sweat from bodies packed close. It wasn't fragrant. It was dense, earthy, the aroma of people who knew survival didn't leave room for perfume. If you'd walked into a winter tipi, it would have hit you like a wall, pungent but oddly reassuring. That smell was proof you were still here, still alive, still breathing under furs instead of under snow. Children grew up in it, cocooned in layers of hide, lulled by the low crackle of the fire and the endless wind outside. Elders taught them without words: tuck your feet deep, wrap the edges tight, stay close to warmth. It was a choreography of bedding, learned young, repeated nightly. And the ground cover wasn't static. Mats and bows were replaced as they grew damp or flattened. Bedding hides were aired out on sunny days, beaten clean of snow, smoked again to keep them supple. The tipi wasn't just pitched and forgotten, it was maintained like a living organism, tended constantly to keep it habitable. So if you'd been there, your bedtime ritual wouldn't have involved brushing your teeth and setting an alarm. It would have been a careful arrangement of mats, robes, fire, and bodies, each part necessary, each part tested against the cold. Because if you left one gap, one draft, one thin layer between yourself and the earth, the plains would take notice. And the plains didn't wait politely until morning to collect their debt. And yet, even with bedding layered thick and hides tucked tight, there was still one more trick for holding heat: the simple animal truth of sleeping pressed close together, letting human bodies themselves become the furnace. Here's the thing you'd have figured out real quick on the plains: you weren't sleeping alone. Privacy was a modern fantasy, the kind you get when central heating lets you drift off in a queen-size bed without caring whether anyone else freezes. Back then, warmth wasn't individual, it was collective. Bodies were insulation, and family was the furnace. Picture it, you, a child, wrapped in buffalo robes so thick they felt like sleeping inside an animal's ribcage, and around you, every relative packed in close, grandparents tucked right where the heat from the fire lingered longest, infants swaddled and wedged in the middle like sacred embers, parents on the edges, forming the first line of defense against drafts. You didn't pick your sleeping spot because you liked it. You got placed like a chess piece in the nightly strategy against hypothermia, and the logic was flawless. Body heat mattered. A dozen people pressed shoulder to shoulder meant you all survived. One person wandering off to sleep alone in the corner wasn't being independent, they were being suicidal. You'd wake up stiff and blue, if you woke up at all. The tipi wasn't a bedroom, it was a communal thermal system, and everybody counted. Now, sure, it wasn't glamorous. You'd get kicked in the shins, elbowed in the ribs, and maybe drooled on in your sleep. Someone's snoring thundered like a bison herd, and children wriggled endlessly, knocking hides off in the middle of the night. But here's the dark little truth: even annoyances became survival tools. That restless child shifting around, they were redistributing warmth. That elder who coughed all night, their breathing added humidity that kept hides supple instead of cracking. Nothing went to waste, not even human discomfort. And it wasn't just family warmth. Dogs often shared the tipi too. Small ones curled at the feet, larger ones along the walls, their own heat contributing to the human huddle. If you've ever had a dog crawl into bed and turn your legs into a furnace, imagine half a dozen of them, steaming up the tipi, shaking off snow, and then snoring louder than the men. Annoying? Absolutely. Essential? Definitely. This intimacy bred a strange kind of security. Outside, the wind screamed, the snow piled high, the night stretched endless. Inside, you were cocooned in the sound of breathing, dozens of chests rising and falling around you. It was claustrophobic, yes, but also oddly comforting, like living inside the heartbeat of a larger body. Alone, you'd freeze. Together, you became something warm, pulsing, alive. And let's be clear, warmth wasn't democratic. Elders and infants got the prime spots, always. If you were a restless young adult, congratulations, you got the drafty edge, where hides shifted and cold air crept in. You learned to live with numb toes while your grandmother sighed contentedly in the center. Fair? Not really. Practical? Completely. Survival had a seating chart, and you weren't at the top. But there was something else, something harder to name. Sharing heat blurred the line between individual and collective. You weren't just yourself, shivering in the night. You were part of a woven body, stitched together by fur, fire, and necessity. When you pressed against your kin, when you felt the low radiance of their skin keeping you alive, you knew this was survival at its most primal. Not technology, not architecture, flesh against flesh, warmth against cold. So yes, if you'd been there, you'd never have complained about personal space. You'd have been grateful for the crush of bodies, the dog at your feet, the elder's heavy breath on your neck, because that wasn't discomfort, that was life. And yet, even all the bodies in the world couldn't save you if you weren't wrapped right, which is why sleeping clothing layers of buckskin, fur, and later wool mattered as much as the hides you pulled over your head. Let's get something straight. You didn't go to bed in a tipi like people today flop into pajamas made of polyester and optimism. Sleeping clothes on the plains weren't about comfort or cute flannel, prints with ducks on them. They were armor layers of skin, fur, and fiber between your flesh and the night. If you stripped down to sleep in sub-zero weather, congratulations, you'd be a corpse in the morning. If you had been born there, your nightwear would have started with buckskin, softened, smoked, and tailored. It hugged the body and held heat while still breathing. Over that came furs, wolf, coyote, rabbit if you were lucky. Buffalo robes weren't just blankets. Sometimes you wrapped yourself in them like a wearable sleeping bag. The cold didn't care that you wanted to look dignified. It demanded bulk. You looked less like a person drifting off to sleep and more like a taxidermy exhibit. And after European contact, wool blankets and trade cloth entered the mix. Heavier than buckskin, coarser too, but prized for their warmth. Layered right, they created a kind of heat cocoon. Layered wrong, you trapped moisture and froze anyway. This wasn't throw on whatever, it was strategy. Clothes were your second wall, the layer you carried even under hides and firelight. Children were swaddled tight, bundled in furs until they looked like small, cranky mummies. Elders kept layers on through the night, joints stiff but insulated. No one undressed fully. Why tempt the cold? He might loosen a belt or remove outer moccasins, but that was as close to pajamas as anyone got. Sleeping naked for warmth. That myth would have earned you a long, cold laugh. And let's be honest, the smell was unforgettable. Layers of smoked buckskin, fur cured with animal brains, wool that hadn't seen soap in months. You didn't go to bed fresh. You went to bed carrying the scent of your day, your hunts, your smoke. But here's the eerie truth. That smell itself was a shield. Oils in the hides repelled moisture, the smoke deterred pests, and the musk clung to you like a second skin against the winter. You didn't fight it. You relied on it. Of course, there would sleep in too many layers, and you woke damp. Sweat turned to ice crystals at your collar. Sleep in too few, and you shivered so hard you kept everyone awake. Finding the balance was an art, one taught through trial, error, and stern correction from elders who'd seen enough blue-lipped youths to know better. Even dogs wore it, in their own way, shaggy coats, thickening through the season, curling beside you like extra blankets that occasionally barked. The whole tipi became one living pile of fur, hide, and fabric, each person wrapped, not for vanity but for sheer endurance. And that was the lesson. Clothing wasn't a matter of day or night, formal or casual. It was constant negotiation with the cold. Every stitch, every layer, every wrap of hide was survival calculus. You didn't go to sleep as yourself. You went to sleep as a bundle of borrowed warmth, stitched from the bodies of animals and the patience of ancestors. So yes, if you had been there, you'd never have taken a soft cotton sheet for granted again. Because back then, every night was a test. Did you wrap right? Did you balance fur against fire, hide against hide? If not, the cold didn't forgive. It just took. And even wrapped in layers, buried under hides, you weren't off duty. Somebody still had to keep the fire breathing, the flaps adjusted, the embers glowing. Warmth wasn't permanent. It was maintained, minute by minute, all through the long night. Here's what you'd learn the first winter on the plains. Warmth was never something you had. It was something you negotiated, constantly, like a bad landlord who kept threatening to evict you. Fires didn't keep themselves. Hides didn't stay dry on their own. And Tipis didn't magically insulate without a little human paranoia thrown in. Survival wasn't set it and forget it. It was upkeep, every single hour. Take the fire. At night, no one just rolled over and thought, that'll last till morning. Fires were banked carefully, coals covered with ash to hold heat, so a simple poke in the dark would bring the glow back to life. Somebody, usually not the elder who got the prime sleeping spot, had the thankless job of waking to feed it. and if they didn't, you'd wake up coughing on frozen breath, your bedding stiff with frost, everyone glaring at the culprit who forgot. Forgetting meant flirting with hypothermia. Hides, too, demanded attention. A buffalo robe that got damp from snow lost its insulating power fast, so they were regularly aired, smoked, and beaten against the cold. Think laundry day, except instead of detergent you had smoke, and instead of smelling fresh, you smelled like a combination of wood ash and dead bison. But that smell, that dense, smoky tang, was the perfume of survival. Even the smoke flaps needed babysitting. Wind direction changed, drafts shifted. Someone had to grab the long poles and angle the flaps so the tipi didn't turn into a death chamber of carbon monoxide. Get it wrong, and you coughed yourself awake, eyes burning, lungs heaving. Get it right, and you breathed easy, warmth staying low, smoke curling up and out like it had been trained to leave politely. And then there were the embers. Those little red hearts of the fire weren't just leftover ash, they were currency. Too many nights on the plains, and you'd learn to treat them like gold. Lose them, and you'd need to start from scratch in the morning, fumbling with flint, tinder, always borrowing fire from a neighbor. Imagine the humiliation of showing up in the snow, shivering, asking, "Hey, can I get a coal?" Survival wasn't just physical, it was reputational. You kept your embers alive, or you were branded careless. Even snow was maintenance. Packed against the tipi's base to seal drafts, it had to be checked. Too little, and the cold slipped under. Too much, and the weight strained poles. Snow wasn't just weather, it was part of your architecture, a building material you shoveled and rearranged like some frozen house guest. Daily maintenance wasn't glamorous, it was repetitive, sweaty, sometimes infuriating. But here's the eerie part, it became rhythm. Children grew up knowing how to feed a fire without sparks, how to pat down hides so they didn't stiffen, how to adjust flaps half asleep. Survival chores blurred into habit, habits into instinct. You didn't think about it anymore. You just did it, the way someone today might check their phone before bed. So if you'd been there, your nights wouldn't have been restful in the modern sense. They were active, watchful, filled with the quiet duties of keeping heat alive. Because warmth wasn't permanent, it was rented, hour by hour, stoked, adjusted, tended. Miss one detail, skip one task, and the plains reminded you, quick and merciless. And yet, for all the smoke and ash, there was another education going on in those tipis. Children weren't just learning chores, they were learning endurance, how to live with discomfort, breathe through the smoke, and accept that cold was never defeated, only managed. If you'd been born on the plains, you wouldn't have grown up complaining about air quality. You'd have grown up marinated in wood smoke. Every night, the tipi doubled as both sanctuary and chimney. That meant the warmth that kept you alive was inseparable from the smoke that stung your eyes and painted your lungs black. And you adapted not because you wanted to, but because the alternative was shivering outside like a cautionary tale. Children learned early how to breathe around it. Shallow, slow, keeping their faces low to the warm air while smoke drifted high. They didn't escape the smoke, they managed it, endured it, learned its moods the way you know your kitchen oven has a hot spot. Red eyes weren't a medical emergency, they were just winter fashion. You learned to cough, blink, and keep tending the fire without whining, because whining didn't make the air any clearer. The tipi's design helped. Those smoke flaps overhead weren't decoration, they were life support. Someone always had an eye on them, shifting poles to angle the draft just right. But even with perfect technique, some smoke lingered. It curled in the rafters, seeped into hides, clung to your hair until you smelled like firewood long after you left. But here's the strange twist. Smoke wasn't just tolerated, it was useful. It tanned hides, preserved meat, kept insects away. It turned a tipi into both heater and smokehouse. What suffocated you one moment saved you the next. And the cold itself, well, you never defeated it. You coexisted with it, negotiated with it, sometimes even weaponized it. Cold air was deliberately allowed in at the base, feeding the fire and pushing smoke upward. Drafts weren't always mistakes, they were part of the system. Too airtight, and you suffocated. Too open, and you froze. The sweet spot was razor thin, and generations trained themselves to find it, half asleep, with one tug on a flap, or one handful of snow stuffed at the edge. Your body, too adapted. Skin toughened against dry air, lungs built tolerance for the bite of frozen mornings. and circulation toughened up so fingers still worked when exposed for chores. Children played in snow, ran barefoot on frozen ground, not because it was fun, but because it hardened them. What felt brutal to outsiders was just training for another winter. And here's where the irony sinks in. Smoke and cold, the very things that seemed to threaten you most, became teachers. They taught resilience, patience, endurance. They taught you to function in discomfort, to rest even when your eyes burned and your nose froze. Survival wasn't about erasing hardship, it was about living in rhythm with it. If you'd grown up there, you wouldn't have cursed the smoke or the chill. You'd have smelled the haze in your clothes and thought, safe. You'd have felt the cold creeping under hides and thought, time to add snow to the base. You'd have turned threats into signals, discomfort into instructions. And that mindset adaptation, instead of complaint, was the real insulation. Because the plains never softened. They only offered brief moments of balance, if you learned how to read them. Which is why the tipi itself shifted with the seasons, shrinking, expanding, layering, always adapting to the rhythm of the year, the way you'd been forced to adapt to smoke and cold. If you'd been living out there, you'd have realized soon enough that a tipi wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It wasn't just a cone plopped on the plains and left the same 12 months of the year. It flexed with the seasons, the way the people themselves flexed, because surviving July's furnace heat took as much ingenuity as surviving January's bone-cracking cold. The tipi wasn't a house, it was a living organism, shedding, layering, and stretching with the rhythm of the year. In winter, the walls thickened. Extra hides went up, grass mats stuffed between liner and cover, snow banked around the base. The whole thing shrank a little smaller. Tipis were easier to heat, less space to fill with fire and breath. Families sometimes doubled up, 2 households squeezing into one shelter just to concentrate warmth. Winter was intimacy and economy. Every pole, every flap, every robe served the same purpose. Keep the heat in, keep the cold out, keep everyone breathing until spring. Then came summer, and suddenly the problem flipped. Too much heat, too much smoke. Those same walls that saved you in January threatened to roast you alive in July. So the tipi opened up. Flaps wide, smoke hole adjusted, liners loosened. Sometimes whole panels were rolled back, letting air stream through. The structure breathed, like a lung expanding to exhale the trapped heat. Summer tipis could be taller, larger, airy with circulation. The same cone that sheltered you from blizzards now became a wind catcher, funneling breezes through. Even fire changed roles with the seasons. In winter, it was lifeblood. In summer, it was reduced, tamed, sometimes moved outside entirely. Cooking fires might burn beyond the doorway, smoke rising harmlessly into open sky. Inside, the hearth shrank, more symbolic than functional, its purpose more about continuity than warmth. And then there were narrations. Tipis weren't permanent houses. They were designed to move with the seasons, following the herds, avoiding the worst storms, seeking fresh grazing and safer camps. Poles were lashed to dogs, or later, horses, hides bundled, camp packed, and gone within hours. Seasonal adjustment wasn't just about walls and flaps, it was about motion, a whole community pivoting with the tilt of the earth. You'd have noticed it in your own bones. In winter, you hunched, wrapped, pressed inward, conserving warmth. In summer, you sprawled, limbs loose, hides light. Your tipi mirrored you tight, layered, sealed in January, open, expanded, breathing in July. Survival wasn't stubborn resistance. It was dance, give and take with the environment, never fighting harder than you had to. And that's the eerie beauty of it. Everything was seasonal. Food, clothing, shelter, even the way you slept. No one pretended they could master the plains year-round with one fixed method. They adjusted, adapted, bent with the cold, opened with the heat, and the tipi was the perfect partner, always shifting, never static. So yes, if you'd been there, you'd have known your house wasn't built once. It was rebuilt, reshaped, reimagined, with every change in weather. And while you might complain today about swapping summer clothes for winter coats, back then, the adjustment wasn't a chore. It was survival, threaded into daily life. But the tipi wasn't just a building or even a climate machine. It was part of something larger, the entire community's system of survival, where warmth wasn't just about individual houses, but shared effort, shared hunts, and shared fires. Here's a little secret about survival on the plains. No one did it alone. You could have the best tipi, the warmest hides, the sharpest instincts. But if you weren't part of a community, you were still a liability. Sooner or later, a frozen cautionary tale. Winter wasn't a private battle. It was collective endurance, stitched together by dozens of small acts of cooperation. Start with the obvious: firewood and fuel. Plains weren't exactly generous with trees, so wood had to be collected, rationed, sometimes hauled in from faraway river bottoms. That wasn't a solo errand. Families shared the load, pooling resources so nobody's fire sputtered out at midnight. Even buffalo chips, the polite word for dried dung, were gathered communally. Yes, you heated your home with manure, and yes, someone had to pick it up by hand. It wasn't glamorous, but it was heat, and in a winter storm, you didn't get picky. Food was the same story. A single family couldn't store enough on its own. Winter survival hinged on the collective hunt. The great buffalo harvests that filled caches with dried meat and fat, turned into pemmican that could last months. Distribution wasn't random, it was deliberate. Elders, children, widows, everyone received their share. Because one weak link in the camp meant another body to bury come spring, and funerals in snow weren't anyone's favorite pastime. Then there was childcare, the silent glue of survival. Infants didn't freeze because their mothers were never alone. Aunties, older siblings, grandmothers all took turns bundling, rocking, and making sure tiny lungs kept breathing in the smoky dark. Knowledge itself was shared communally. Children were taught how to tuck hides, bank fires, fetch snow for water, not as individual chores but as pieces of the larger survival machine. If one person faltered, the system held. Camp arrangement reinforced this. Tipis weren't scattered randomly across the prairie. They were set in circles, each family contributing to the shared windbreak, the collective defense, the psychological comfort of being enclosed by kin. Fires rose together, smoke plumes curling into the sky like signals that the community was still intact, still breathing, still stronger than the storm clawing outside. And let's not forget the elders. In a modern world obsessed with youth, they'd be dismissed as unproductive. But in a winter camp, elders were archives of survival. They remembered which valleys sheltered best from storms, which rivers stayed open for water, which tricks with snow and hides saved lives. They were the living manuals everyone else depended on, even as their bodies slowed. Disregard them, and you'd pay with mistakes you couldn't afford to make twice. It's easy to romanticize it, but community support wasn't always harmonious. Tensions flared, resources stretched, people disagreed. But the cold didn't care about your grudges. You pulled together, or you froze together. That was the law of the plains, merciless, undeniable. Survival wasn't about rugged individuals. It was about webs of obligation, mutual aid enforced by necessity more than by kindness. So if you'd been there, you wouldn't have imagined yourself a lone hero, stoking your fire against the storm. You'd have known your warmth came from many hands. The hunters who filled the stores, the women who stitched the hides, the neighbors who lent a coal when your fire failed. Survival wasn't singular, it was symphonic, and every note mattered. And woven into that communal effort was another layer altogether: belief. Because even the endless grind of practical tasks wasn't enough without the fire of meaning. And that meaning came from ritual, from story, from seeing the tipi and its hearth not just as tools, but as sacred guardians against the abyss of cold. If you had been there, crouched in a winter tipi with the fire smoldering and snow hissing against the hides, you would have noticed something. The heat wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The flames at the center didn't just keep you alive, they kept the world in balance. Every ember, every crackle, every curl of smoke rising through the flaps was more than survival, it was ritual in motion. See, fire wasn't a background detail, it was sacred, a living presence, connecting the people inside to the vast, unseen world outside. Sparks rising into the night weren't just smoke, they were prayers, carrying human breath into the sky, a reminder that even in the middle of winter's cruelty, you were linked to forces larger than yourself. You didn't just stoke coals, you tended a relationship with the divine. The tipi itself was more than clever engineering. Its conical body was cosmology and architecture. The poles stretching upward met, at a point, like a ladder into the heavens, while the fire burned at the base, anchoring life to earth. Inside those walls, you weren't just protected from the cold, you were living inside a universe made tangible. Every night, sleeping under that shape, you were being taught. Your home is a microcosm, your life part of something vast. And that symbolism wasn't abstract. It was daily, practical. Blessings accompanied the fire. Stories were told in its light myths that explained why the stars glittered, why the animals gave their hides, why the world itself continued through snowstorms. Those stories weren't entertainment. They were survival psychology, a way to keep morale and meaning alive when the night stretched endlessly and despair crouched just outside the hides. Even the act of banking a fire or adjusting smoke flaps could carry ritual weight. Balance had to be kept. Too much smoke, too little heat, too strong a flame, and that balance echoed into cosmology. The world worked the same way. Harmony had to be maintained between people, animals, land, and spirit. To care for your fire and your shelter wasn't just housework. It was keeping the universe itself in order. And it wasn't only about fire. Snow, too, carried symbolic weight. Covering the base of the tipi, it became both enemy and ally, destruction and protection. To live inside a snow-banked tipi was to live in dialogue with contradiction. The very thing that wanted you dead was also keeping you warm. You didn't fight the paradox, you honored it, lived inside it. If you'd been there, you'd have felt it in your bones. The eerie comfort of firelight flickering across painted hides, the steady drone of a storyteller's voice weaving animals and spirits into the walls. The knowledge that your house wasn't just sticks and skins, it was the center of a living cosmos. And when the wind howled outside, trying to erase you, you would have understood. This wasn't only about warmth. It was about order, belonging, identity. Because winter wasn't only a season, it was a test. A test of body, yes, but also of meaning. And without that meaning, the cold would have hollowed you out long before it froze you. So the tipi wasn't just survival technology. It was philosophy stitched in hide, cosmology woven in poles. It kept you alive because it reminded you why life was worth protecting. And that's what made the whole system work. The fusion of practicality and spirit, of hides and stories, of fire and meaning. A fusion that gave you the strength to endure until morning and to face another night. But here's the final truth. None of it, neither hides nor fire nor ritual, would have mattered if the design itself hadn't been so brilliantly effective. The tipi was not just clever, it was resilient technology, refined across generations, capable of holding off the plains' most brutal cold. If you'd been born into that world of snow, wind, and endless horizon, you would have learned early that the real miracle wasn't brute strength or luck, it was design. The tipi wasn't an accident of architecture, it was a masterpiece of survival, perfected over centuries by people who had no margin for error. Think about it. A shelter that could be packed up in hours, hauled across miles, and reassembled before nightfall. Light enough to move, yet sturdy enough to withstand storms that sent settlers' wooden cabins creaking into splinters. Mobile, adaptable, elegant, and still warmer than most fixed homes of the same period. You wouldn't have called it primitive, you'd have called it genius, if you weren't too busy trying not to freeze. Every element of it worked with the land, not against it. Conical walls deflected the wind. Smoke flaps created natural ventilation. Liners trapped warm air at the base. Hides, mats, and snowbanks layered into insulation. Bedding and robes lifted you from frozen ground. Fire warmed without suffocating. And orientation turned each doorway into both shield and compass. It wasn't one trick. It was dozens of little tricks, each one learned, tested, and passed down until failure was no longer an option. And it wasn't static. That's what makes it eerie when you think about it today. Westinghouses were built to resist the landstone against soil, timber against wind. But the tipi flexed with the seasons. It shrank in winter, expanded in summer, breathed when it had to, sealed when it must. It didn't pretend to be invincible. It adapted, constantly, the way its people did. Survival wasn't just about engineering, though it was about resilience embodied. The tipi taught patience, the steady tending of fire, the constant adjustment of flaps, the nightly dance of bedding and robes. It taught humility, dependence on animals, on community, on the shared warmth of bodies. And it taught endurance. That smoke in your eyes and cold at your ankles weren't failures. They were simply reminders that life on the plains always came at a price. If you'd lived it, you would have seen how the tipi was less a house than a philosophy in hide and pole. It embodied a worldview where nothing stood alone. Fire, snow, skin, wind, body, all intertwined, all negotiating, all keeping you alive for another dawn. It was resilience, not comfort. Balance, not conquest. And here's the part that might sting a little. This so-called primitive technology outperformed many of the advanced structures Europeans brought to the plains. Cabins rotted, sod houses leaked, log shelters trapped smoke until lungs collapsed. But the tipi kept people alive through winters settlers barely understood. The design was so effective that even U.S. military campaigns noted its efficiency, often stealing the form for their own field shelters. So if you'd been there, buried under robes, fire flickering on your smoke-stung face, you would have known you weren't just surviving because of hides or firewood. You were surviving because of knowledge, refined into design, carried forward by memory. The tipi was more than shelter. It was resilience in physical form, an answer to a land that tried every night to erase you. And when the wind howled outside, rattling the walls, you would have smiled in your sleep, not because you were comfortable, not because you were safe, but because you were still here, alive, wrapped inside a design older, wiser, and tougher than the cold itself. For most of human history, the bed wasn't a private sanctuary. It was a crowded raft on a cold sea, a place where survival had less to do with dreams and more to do with body temperature. The idea of a person sleeping alone, wrapped in cotton sheets in a climate-controlled room, would have seemed absurd, like deliberately starving in a house full of bread. In pre-industrial Europe, families squeezed into box beds built into the walls of one-room cottages. Wooden enclosures with sliding panels trapped warmth and occasionally lice in equal measure. In Scandinavia, entire households folded themselves into raised sleeping platforms, arranged shoulder to shoulder like sardines who had misplaced their dignity but not their sense of survival. And in Japan, the futon wasn't just a minimalist aesthetic, it was a communal mattress rolled out at night, with parents, children, and sometimes grandparents pressed together under heavy quilts. The human equivalent of a coal pile smoldering against the cold. Even in wealthier homes, where actual bed frames groaned under carved posts and embroidered canopies, the mattress was rarely private. Servants sometimes slept at the foot of their master's bed. Travelers and apprentices shared space with kin. A bed was expensive, a privilege too valuable to be wasted on one body when several could occupy it. What mattered most wasn't intimacy or privacy, but the simple arithmetic of warmth. Across the Atlantic, the logic held. On the plains, hides were spread across mats of reeds, and families curled tightly together near the central fire. Children in the middle, elders to the sides, young adults left to fend against drafts at the edges. In Arctic igloos, Inuit families slept pressed together under caribou skins, their combined heat raising the small interior to tolerable temperatures, while outside the air could snap leather straps like twigs. Warmth wasn't furniture. It was collective discipline. The irony was that this arrangement was as social as it was thermal. Beds weren't just where bodies kept one another alive. They were where kinship was reinforced in silence. Whispered stories passed down in the dark. Siblings squabbled until exhaustion won. Lovers made do with the quiet complicity of everyone else pretending to sleep. The shared bed was a cultural institution, one that blurred the line between necessity and intimacy. Of course, the conditions weren't always poetic. Breath condensed on walls, straw bedding turned damp, vermin thrived in the heat. Some medieval households even shared with animals, dogs, goats, occasionally pigs, contributing their body heat to the human huddle. To modern sensibilities, it sounds grotesque. To them, it was practical. Why waste a perfectly warm dog on the floor when it could keep your feet from turning into frozen stumps? The practice also carried a quiet hierarchy. Infants and the elderly claimed the center, protected from drafts and sudden shifts. Unmarried adults found themselves pushed to the edges, a nightly reminder of their social position. The shared bed wasn't egalitarian. It mapped the family's structure onto flesh and fur, visible every night in the order of who shivered most. So the bed was never just furniture. It was survival strategy, social theater, and occasionally pest hotel. It reminded everyone, night after night, that survival was not individual but collective. And as the fire dimmed and the walls leaked cold, the press of bodies became the only real insulation left. Yet the bed was only part of the story. The enemy wasn't the furniture, it was the cold itself. That silent, creeping intruder that seeped through walls, slid across floors, and tested every arrangement of flesh and fabric to see who would make it to morning. Cold was the uninvited guest in every house, every hut, every tent. It slipped in through cracks in timber, seeped through thatched roofs, crept up from stone floors, and lay in wait the moment fires burned low. In northern Europe, frost sometimes formed on the inside walls of cottages, sparkling prettily until you realized it was announcing that the outdoors had colonized your bedroom. In poorly insulated cabins of early America, water set by the hearth could freeze overnight, as if mocking the very idea of shelter. For most people, there was no escape. Chimneys were drafty, fires produced more smoke than heat, and houses were built with a speed that betrayed how little choice there was. At night, the temperature inside might differ from outside by only a few miserable degrees. You could pile on straw mattresses, quilts, hides, yet cold always found a way in. It crept at your ankles, gnawed at your fingertips, stiffened your joints until they felt older than your years. In the Arctic, cold wasn't an inconvenience. It was the ruler. Igloos ingeniously carved from snow itself used the paradox of frozen water to trap heat. Families packed tightly inside raised the temperature by sheer respiration, bringing the interior from lethal to merely uncomfortable. Elsewhere, nomadic herders in Central Asia sealed their yurts against icy steppes. Layering felt so thick that the walls became less structure than insulation device. And still, nights were a negotiation. How long the firewood lasted, how much warmth bodies could generate, how much loss could be tolerated before dawn. Cold was not democratic. It punished the young and old most severely. Infants were swaddled until they resembled parcels, stuffed between adults like living embers to keep them from stiffening in the night. Elders, with weaker circulation, relied on their central place in the bedcircle. If either slipped into the edge zones, cold could claim them by morning. These weren't abstract fears. Families knew from experience who had succumbed when the balance tipped. The irony is that cold was both intimate and impersonal. It touched everyone, equally and mercilessly, yet it forced closeness as defense. Pressing together wasn't sentimental, it was tactical, a collective human wall against the invader seeping through hide, straw, or timber. Even the smallest gap between bodies became an entry point. Too much space, and heat drained out as if the cold had been waiting for the opportunity. And still, the enemy wasn't entirely faceless. Cold left signatures. Frostbite chewed ears and fingers. Chilblains swelled skin until it cracked. The ache in bones never quite left. Even after spring returned, cold taught its lessons permanently, etched onto the body like warnings. It wasn't just whether it was an adversary that set the terms of life indoors. So, night after night, families layered against it, fought it with fire, with hides, with breath, and most of all, with each other's warmth. Cold wasn't a visitor you could shut out. It was a tenant in the walls, and the only way to outlast it was to resist together. But if the cold was relentless, so too was the human response, turning flesh itself into furnace, pressing bodies into heaters, using biology as the final shield. The answer wasn't in the walls or the roofs. It was in the bodies themselves, clustered together to make warmth from nothing but breath and skin. A single human body at rest produces about as much heat as a dim light bulb warm enough to fog glass, useless against a draft. But put a dozen together in the same space, pressed skin to skin under layers of hide or wool, and suddenly you have a heating system. It wasn't technology. It was biology weaponized against winter. In peasant cottages of medieval Europe, the family bed was a deliberate furnace. 2 parents, several children, maybe a servant, all wrapped in straw mattresses and patchwork quilts, became a collective radiator. The warmth generated was crude but undeniable. Steam rising, breath mingling, blankets damp from condensation by dawn. Not pleasant, but it was either that or the cold gnawed its way through flesh. On the Arctic tundra, Inuit families treated body heat as the first resource, fire as the second. Inside igloos, where lamps fueled by seal oil flickered faintly, the real warmth came from caribou skins layered over bodies pressed tightly together. Infants weren't simply swaddled, they were inserted between adults, absorbing the heat radiated from both sides like precious, living coals. A single person would freeze. A family fused into a breathing pile could survive a night when the air outside shattered bone. The principle was universal. Among nomadic herders in Central Asia, felt-lined yurts held families like cocoons. each body reinforcing the others. In the plains of North America, people slept in concentric order around a fire, elders and children in the warmest spots, others on the edges. The warmth wasn't sentimental, it was arithmetic. Alone, you radiated heat. Together, you built a climate. And the system didn't stop at humans. Dogs crept into beds, livestock sometimes into homes. A cow in the byre beneath a loft added degrees of warmth above. Sheep penned near sleeping areas exhaled heat like radiators wrapped in wool. Even fleas and lice, thriving in the dense heat, became inadvertent contributors to the strange ecosystem of the bed. Misery, yes, but warmer misery than isolation could ever provide. The strangeness of it is that bodies weren't just heat sources, they were regulators. Too much fire in a poorly ventilated hut, and smoke suffocated the room, but pressed flesh balanced the environment, producing a steady, predictable warmth that no woodpile could replicate without choking everyone half to death. In a world where firewood was scarce and fuel unpredictable, bodies were the only renewable energy available every single night. Of course, it came at a cost. Overheating meant damp bedding, condensation dripping from rafters, straw turned soggy and moldy. But even that was a price families accepted. Better to wake sweaty and flea-bitten than to wake stiff and blue. Comfort was expendable. Warmth was not. So the bed was never only about rest. It was a biological contract, each sleeper contributing to the group's heat budget, each breath adding to the communal furnace. Solitude was a luxury people could not afford, because the human body was designed to keep itself warm and its neighbors warmer still. But bodies alone didn't determine survival. Where they lay, how they were arranged, and how much space they occupied mattered just as much. The architecture of the family and of the house dictated not just who slept where, but who lived through the night. The architecture of the bed was never random. It followed the architecture of the family, which in turn was dictated by the architecture of the house, or more often, the single room that pretended to be a house. Space was precious, and walls were thin. The line between sleeping arrangement and survival chart looked suspiciously the same. In a medieval peasant cottage, there was rarely more than one true bed. A wooden frame crammed with straw mattresses, piled high with patchwork covers, might serve a family of 6. Parents in the middle, children tucked around them, the youngest crammed nearest the warmth of 2 adult bodies. If there were servants or apprentices, they might sleep at the foot, curled like watchdogs. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a fantasy for nobles and poets. The family bed was democracy only in the sense that everyone was equally cramped. In the Scottish Highlands, box beds built into walls turned the whole arrangement into a coffin-shaped cupboard with a sliding panel. The family would vanish into this dark compartment at night, huddled together on straw pallets, the door closed to trap heat. To a modern visitor it might look macabre, but for them it was insurance. A small, warm chamber carved out of a freezing stone house. Japanese households used futons on tatami floors, unrolled each evening and stacked in layers of quilts. A row of bodies lay side by side like punctuation marks, the eldest near the head of the futon line, the youngest near the center. The house, minimally insulated, offered little resistance to winter drafts. It was the neat order of bodies under quilts that gave the illusion of warmth. A choreography repeated every night, without question. The smaller the dwelling, the more compressed the arrangement. Longhouses among the Iroquois housed multiple families along a single corridor. Each nuclear family gathered around its own hearth. But when the fire dimmed, warmth spilled into neighboring spaces. Even architecture itself assumed families were not solitary units, but interdependent clusters, pressed by design into both physical and social intimacy. Hierarchy was visible even in sleep. Parents claimed the warmer spots, often the middle or against walls that held heat. Infants were shielded within arm's reach, easy to feed and guard against smothering drafts. Older children and unmarried adults were pushed to the edges, a nightly reminder of their position in the order of things. Beds were maps of kinship, as legible as any genealogy scroll. Who you lay beside wasn't only about it was about status, duty, and trust. And this proximity carried consequences, with everyone stacked together like kindling. Every cough, every fever, every infestation passed effortlessly from one body to the next. Illness moved with the same ease as warmth, binding families in health and in misery. The bed was hospital, quarantine ward, an epidemic incubator all at once. But again, the calculation never changed. Better to risk contagion in company than to freeze in solitude. So space was always compressed, orchestrated according to bloodline and need. A bed wasn't a piece of furniture. What's the spatial embodiment of family structure? A diagram you could lie down inside. And at the very center of this diagram lay the most fragile, most demanding bodies of all, the children, whose vulnerability dictated much of the system. Children were the reason families pressed together as tightly as they did. Not because anyone believed in sentimental hallmark warmth, but because small bodies lose heat faster than big ones, and small bodies were the ones cold preferred to claim first. Infants in particular were walking liabilities, poor insulation, poor circulation, and no sense of how to keep a fire alive. A baby alone in winter wasn't a baby by morning, which is why in so many cultures, children weren't placed beside parents as a matter of affection, but as a matter of survival calculus. In European cottages, newborns often slept directly between the mother and father, the human equivalent of sandwiching a hot coal so it wouldn't burn out. In Arctic families, infants were swaddled in caribou skin and wedged under blankets, their little heads poking out into the shared warmth of adult breath. The point wasn't comfort. It was maintaining a constant supply of heat, 24 hours a day. And when space was cramped in, it was always cramped. Children didn't get their own corner. They were stuffed in wherever their survival odds were highest. In the Scottish Highlands, where box beds were as airtight as coffins, children were crammed into the middle, layers of quilts and adult limbs sealing them against drafts. Japanese families tucked children in the center of futon lines, older siblings forming a warm barricade on either side. On the plains, babies were bundled in cradle boards during the day, but at night, unstrapped and placed between parents, wrapped in hides, as if the family itself were the blanket. But even protection had its risks. In Europe, the danger of overlaying was well known. Infants suffocated when adults rolled onto them during sleep. To guard against this, some families built wooden cradles right into the bed frame, so the child was close enough to share heat, but boxed in against accidental smothering. That delicate balance, warmth without suffocation, was part of the nightly gamble. Older children weren't safe either. Their smaller size meant colder extremities, slower recovery from drafts, and weaker resistance to illness. So they, too, were assigned to the warm zones, pressed against siblings, nested between adults, shielded by whatever furs or quilts could be spared. Childhood wasn't independence. It was enforced dependence, written every night in the shape of the bed. The eerie part is how casual the arrangement became. Families didn't discuss it, didn't debate it. They simply placed the youngest where warmth pooled strongest, the way you might put a kettle close to the stove. It was instinct and tradition, but also observation. Those who strayed too far toward the edges were the ones whose lips turned blue first. And this arrangement carried unspoken lessons. Children grew up with the knowledge, literally in their bones, that survival was communal, that their warmth wasn't their own, but borrowed from the bodies surrounding them. They learned dependence first, then responsibility, eventually taking their turn at the edges as younger siblings took the middle. So the nightly ritual of pressing close wasn't just about protecting children, it was shaped by them. Fragile bodies dictated sleeping patterns, dictated hierarchy, dictated proximity, and those same fragile bodies often dictated that warmth extended beyond humans alone. Because if every degree of heat mattered, why waste the steady warmth of animals sleeping just outside when they could be brought into the bed as well? When human heat wasn't enough, and it rarely was, families turned to their most reliable furnaces. Animals, not as metaphors, but as literal, four-legged heaters with fur. A dog curled against your legs wasn't companionship. It was insulation. A goat tied near the bed wasn't a nuisance. It was an extra radiator that bleated. Medieval peasants often kept livestock under the same roof, partly for security, partly for convenience, but mostly for warmth. In single-room cottages, cows might occupy the byre at one end, their body heat rising into the loft where the family slept. The arrangement wasn't romantic. It smelled like manure, buzzed with flies, and filled the house with steam, but the additional degrees of warmth could mean the difference between waking sore and waking stiff as timber. Dogs had a more intimate role. Small breeds in particular functioned as living hot water bottles. The term three-dog night comes from this reality. How many dogs it took to keep a human warm enough to survive the cold. Families let dogs under quilts, at their feet, sometimes even against infants, trusting the animal's body heat to guard tiny lungs from freezing. Hygiene wasn't the question. Survival was. Cats, too, earned their place not just as pest control but as warmth. A cat curled on your chest or neck in winter wasn't simply acting on feline laziness. It was a practical distribution of heat. If fleas thrived in the shared bedding anyway, what difference did another layer of fur make? In Arctic regions, sled dogs sometimes shared igloos, their breath contributing to the fragile interior climate. Among nomadic herders of Central Asia, sheep and goats bedded close to sleeping platforms, their collective warmth pooling with the families. Even in Europe, pigs were occasionally kept indoors during deep winter, their thick bodies acting as both emergency food source and nighttime heating system. To modern sensibilities, it sounds grotesque. To them, it was pragmatic. And of course, these animals weren't passive heaters, they shaped the bed itself. Children slept curled against dogs, adults pressed against livestock pen walls, whole families arranging themselves to capture the maximum warmth from their animals. The nightly huddle was a mixed species affair, a living furnace built of whatever bodies could be collected. It's worth remembering, houses of stone and wood leaked heat like sieves. Insulation was a dream, windows were drafty, and fuel for fires was never guaranteed. So the animal bed wasn't indulgence, it was mathematics. Each body added heat. Each heat source made the night survivable. And when resources were scarce, animals were simply part of the household's thermal economy. Yet the intimacy of it was striking. Families didn't only depend on animals for food or labor, they depended on them in the most vulnerable hours of the night. Warmth was shared across species, with no illusions of hierarchy once the frost settled in. Survival blurred boundaries. Humans, dogs, goats, pigs, all pressed together in one damp, steaming bundle of existence. And this strange alliance turned the bed into more than a piece of furniture. It became a theater of relationships between humans, but also between humans and animals, bonded less by affection than by necessity. Still, necessity has a way of creating its own kind of intimacy. And those nights, when warmth depended on the silent trust of bodies beside you, became not just survival strategy, but a nightly rehearsal of community itself. But warmth was never the only function of these beds. Packed together in darkness, bodies weren't only heating machines, they were also social instruments. The shared bed became a stage for whispers, for quarrels, for stories, for the everyday performance of kinship. Pressed together for warmth, families discovered that the bed was never just a mattress, a platform, or a pile of hides. It was a stage, and every night the same play unfolded. Survival, yes, but also society rehearsed in miniature. Bodies radiated heat, but they also radiated meaning. Who lay where, who whispered to whom, who got the central spots, and who languished at the edges. None of it was random. In medieval Europe, the shared bed doubled as the household's parliament. Parents whispered decisions after children drifted off. Apprentices absorbed the rhythms of family life from the same cramped frame. Siblings learned the hierarchy of age, not just in chores, but in inches of mattress. The older pressing closer to warmth, the younger nudged toward the chill. Secrets were rare, gossip constant, silence impossible. The bed was a confessional without privacy. In Japan, futons unrolled across tatami floors created a choreography of kinship. The eldest occupied the head of the line, children stacked in the middle, order visibly reasserted every night. In Arctic igloos, huddled families turned storytelling into a form of insulation. Myths recited not in daylight ceremonies but whispered in the dark. The warmth of narrative rising alongside body heat. To fall asleep wasn't just to rest, it was to drift into the shared memory of a people. A memory maintained by stories told across generations, pressed shoulder to shoulder. And intimacy didn't stop at stories. Couples shared beds not alone but in the presence of children, elders, or servants. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Marital sex happened quietly under quilts, ignored with polite blindness by the rest of the household. For children, this blurred intimacy was simply part of the nightly environment, folded into the larger education of what it meant to be alive in a crowded, fragile dwelling. Conflict, too, had its place. Beds bore witness to quarrels whispered in the dark, siblings elbowing for space, parents hushing disputes before the fire guttered out. Sleeping together demanded compromise. Who breathed too loudly, who stole covers, who rolled into the draft. The shared bed was not only warmth, but training in negotiation, discipline, endurance. It was also entertainment. With daylight hours consumed by labor, evening in bed became the rare moment for relaxation. Songs hummed, jokes traded, lullabies drifting through the smoke-stained air. The bed was laughter, stories, lull, quarrel, reconciliation, all of it, performed under the covers, while the cold pressed outside. What's unsettling is how much of society's order was inscribed there. The arrangement of bodies wasn't symbolic, it was literal law. The patriarch against the wall, the matriarch beside him, children filling gaps, animals at the feet. You could read a household's entire hierarchy just by looking at who shivered where. The bed was census, family tree, and theater all in one. So when families pressed together for warmth, they weren't only fighting frost, they were rehearsing the order of their world. Kinship was drawn in straw and quilt, whispered in stories, enforced in sleeping order. Warmth held them, but meaning bound them tighter still. And yet, this nightly institution was never fixed. The rhythm of seasons pressed on it, changing how bodies gathered, how close they pressed, how long they endured the nightly huddle. When winter came, beds grew crowded. When summer eased the cold, bodies spread apart, rehearsing an entirely different kind of intimacy. The bed was never a fixed arrangement. It breathed with the seasons, contracting in winter until families resembled a single tangled organism, then loosening in summer as warmth returned and space briefly became affordable. Sleep itself had a seasonal pulse, dictated not by preference but by weather and fuel. In the depths of winter, beds were packed to capacity. More bodies meant more heat, and every inch of straw, fur, or quilt was pressed into service. Entire households collapsed into one, space parents, children, servants, sometimes travelers stacked as tightly as firewood. Breathing was collective, blankets heavy, the air damp with condensation. Nights were long, firewood scarce, and the only efficient way to outlast the cold was to sleep like a herd. But in summer, when nights were short and warmth less fickle, sleeping arrangements shifted. In Europe, children sprawled on benches, lofts, or even outside under lean-tos. In Japan, futons unrolled in wider rows, space distributed more generously. Plains families sometimes slept outside their tipis altogether, taking advantage of breezes that winter had turned into killers. Privacy, impossible in January, became briefly negotiable in July. This seasonal ebb and flow wasn't just about comfort. It mirrored labor patterns. Winter kept people indoors, nights stretching endlessly, firelight the only clock. Summer pulled people outward into fields, hunts, and festivals, their exhausted bodies collapsing wherever space allowed. The bed expanded and contracted with the calendar, shaping intimacy differently depending on the month. Children learned the rhythm early. Winter meant being buried under bodies and quilts, waking with stiff limbs and the taste of smoke in their mouths. Summer meant slipping outside, finding a corner or a mat, listening to insects instead of snores. Both were normal, neither romantic. They were simply two sides of the same survival strategy: compress in the cold, scatter in the heat. Even architecture reflected this rhythm. Yurts in Central Asia could be lined with layers of felt in winter, trapping every ounce of warmth. Come summer, those same walls were stripped down, air streaming through gaps. European cottages saw fires banked high in January, beds wedged into box-like alcoves. By midsummer, windows opened, families sleeping lighter, sheets replacing furs. The home itself shape-shifted with the seasons, and the bed shifted with it. And yet, the memory of winter never disappeared. Even in warmer months, families didn't stray far from the old formations. Sleeping together had become a cultural imprint, a nightly rehearsal of kinship. Cold might have been the original architect of the huddle, but tradition made sure the pattern persisted long after the frost retreated. Seasonality turned the bed into a calendar. You could tell the time of year not by the sun, but by how many people were wedged against your ribs, how heavy the blankets pressed down, how loud the collective snoring swelled in the dark. Survival wasn't just written in firewood stacks and food stores. It was written in how bodies shifted through the seasons, compressing, loosening, always negotiating with the climate. But this rhythm also highlights how alien modern ideas of privacy really are. For most of history, there was no such thing as my bed. There was only our bed, expanded or contracted by season, by need, by survival. which leads to the uncomfortable truth. Privacy, that prized modern luxury, is barely more than a historical accident. To sleep alone is a modern fantasy. For most of history, privacy in the bedroom wasn't just scarce, it was laughable. The idea of having one's own room, with a door that locked and walls thick enough to block noise, would have sounded like something only kings and saints could dream of. Everyone else slept where they could, and usually that meant beside someone else's elbow, knee, or livestock. Medieval peasants in Europe curled into family beds because space was too precious to waste. In small cottages, the fire smoldered in the same room where food was cooked, tools were stored, and bodies collapsed at night. A private bedchamber. The closest equivalent was a wooden box bed tucked into the wall, and even that usually held more than one sleeper. The sliding panels weren't for modesty, they were true trap heat, like a coffin with blankets. Even nobility, who could technically afford larger quarters, didn't expect solitude. Royal chambers often included servants sleeping at the foot of the bed, ladies in waiting on benches, guards stationed just outside. Privacy was both impractical and suspicious. To close oneself off completely was to invite rumors of secrecy, plotting, or worse. Sleep was public business, and the warmth of bodies was considered worth the loss of discretion. In Japan, futon lines rolled out across tatami floors kept whole households visible, the sleeping order mirroring social order. On the plains, Tipis arranged family members in predictable formations around the fire. In Arctic igloos, the raised sleeping platform was a stage where everyone's breath condensed together. Nowhere was there space for the fantasy of the solitary sleeper. The community's survival was too fragile to be risked for one person's comfort. And yet, it is striking how quickly privacy has been reimagined as a necessity in the modern world. Central heating, insulated walls, glass windows, all these inventions replaced the thermal logic of communal sleeping. Suddenly, children had their rooms, couples had their space, and sleeping alone stopped looking like exile and started looking like achievement. What once marked vulnerability, lying in bed without other bodies to guard and warm you, now marks independence. The eerie irony is that solitude in sleep was, for most of history, a punishment. Exile from the bed meant exclusion from warmth, protection, and intimacy. To be forced to sleep outside the circle was to risk frost, predators, or simply loneliness so raw it gnawed at survival instincts. Privacy was isolation, and isolation could kill. So the modern insistence on privacy in sleep is both an achievement and a cultural amnesia. The heated home made the solitary bed possible, but it also erased the memory of how unnatural that solitude once felt. We imagine privacy as timeless, when in truth it is barely older than the thermostat. And yet, across cultures, traces of the old logic remain. Families co-sleep in many parts of the world, not as a quaint tradition, but as a continuation of survival's arithmetic. Infants still pressed between parents, elders still tucked into the warmest spots. The communal bed may have retreated, but it has never vanished. But what's most fascinating is that even as cultures invented privacy, the old universal pattern endured. From Arctic hunters to European peasants to nomadic herders, the nightly huddle was the great constant. And that continuity across geography and time reminds us that pressed-together warmth wasn't a cultural oddity. It was human universality. The family huddle at night wasn't a cultural quirk, it was a global script, repeated in different costumes. Every society wrote its own version, but the refrain was the same: press together or perish. In Northern Europe, the box bed sealed warmth into wooden compartments, whole families crammed inside like cargo. In Japan, futons on tatami created neat rows of sleepers, the order of bodies echoing the order of society. In the Arctic, igloos transformed the paradox of snow into shelter, the raised sleeping platform turning breath and body heat into life-saving insulation. And across the Great Plains, tipis became mobile hearths, their interiors arranged around firelight, children and elders placed where warmth was richest. Variation lay not in the principle, but in the choreography. Some societies lined bodies side by side, others stacked them by age and importance. Still others wrapped them in hides until individuality disappeared into a collective cocoon. In each case, architecture, climate, and kinship dictated the details, but the logic was identical. Warmth required proximity, and proximity reshaped what family meant. Even the inclusion of animals, often dismissed in modern retellings as rustic oddity, was nearly universal. Dogs curled into straw bedding in Europe, sled animals sometimes slept inside Arctic dwellings, livestock warmed lofts and barns in northern farms. The human bed was rarely just human, it was an ecosystem of species pressed into one small circle of survival. And yet, despite all the variations, the continuity is startling. Whether in stone cottages or felt yurts, whether under feather quilts or caribou hides, humans arrived at the same nightly conclusion. Bodies were the only renewable furnace. Every culture bent its architecture, rituals, and intimacy around this truth. Modernity fractured the pattern but didn't erase it. Central heating allowed bedrooms to separate, privacy to flourish, solitary sleep to become a marker of independence. Yet echoes linger. Families co-sleep with infants across much of the world. In emergencies, blackouts, disasters, war, people revert instinctively to the old pattern, clustering together for warmth as though memory itself knows the script better than technology does. And beneath it all lies the reminder that warmth was never just physical. Pressed bodies transmitted not only heat but care, hierarchy, obligation. To share a bed was to share existence at its most vulnerable. It was to recognize, night after night, that survival was collective. The modern solitary sleeper might celebrate independence, but history whispers something else, that humans were shaped in the furnace of the communal bed. Every culture confirmed it, every winter enforced it, and every huddle carried the same unspoken law. To be warm was to be together. For most of human history, sleep was never taken for granted. It wasn't a guaranteed luxury, tucked into the folds of linen sheets and secured by thermostats. It was a risky crossing. Too close one's eyes was to step out of the known world and into something far less predictable. Where the body grew limp, the mind slipped its leash, and the night itself pressed in with 1,000 uncertainties. Anthropologists sometimes call it a liminal state, but most people across centuries would have simply called it dangerous. Dreams blurred with visions. A sudden stop of breath in the night could be a demon sitting on the chest. Failure to wake could mean the soul had wandered too far from the body and failed to return. To sleep was to volunteer for absence, and absence always needed explanation. That's why rituals clung to the edges of the night like watchmen at a gate. Before bedding down, people lit lamps, whispered prayers, touched charms, or muttered protective formulas. It wasn't superstition for its own sake. It was insurance for the crossing. To survive the night meant more than surviving the cold. It meant surviving the invisible traffic that came alive after sundown. Consider ancient Egypt, where dreams were taken so seriously that manuals existed to interpret them. A dream wasn't random static from the brain, it was a coded message from gods or spirits, sometimes benevolent, sometimes not. Without preparation, without ritual, the sleeper risked being caught off guard by those messages, or worse, dragged into them too deeply. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded elaborate rites to banish night demons that prowled bedrooms, believed responsible for suffocation, miscarriages, and sudden death in sleep. The body was passive, the soul in transit, and the gap between the two had to be guarded. Even in Christian Europe centuries later, prayers before bed were less about gratitude and more about survival. If I should die before I wake wasn't poetic flourish. It was grim recognition that every night carried a non-zero chance of never waking. Disease struck hardest in the silent hours, fires spread while households slept, and death by freezing was quietest under quilts. To prepare for bed meant to prepare for the possibility of not returning from it. And behind all this was the darkness itself, the thick, unlit expanse that enveloped homes once the fire died low. With no electric light to reassure, the night was a wall of silence punctuated by the occasional snap of wood, distant howl of an animal, or shift of wind through cracks. The bed wasn't refuge. It was exposure, softened only by the conviction that ritual gestures could place a shield between flesh and the unseen. So the act of lying down was framed as something more than a bodily need. It was a ritual threshold, a daily rehearsal of death and return. Every whispered blessing, every charm hung over the door, every ember left glowing in the hearth, wasn't about comfort. It was about bracing for the journey. Stepping into a space where sleep wasn't neutral, it was survival enacted through the fragile scaffolding of belief. And that's what made the night feel heavier than the day. Daylight exposed dangers clearly. At night, dangers were invisible, half-imagined, wholly terrifying. And those terrors, whether prowling animals, wandering spirits, or simply the human imagination, made sleep itself a contested ground, one that demanded defenses before surrendering to it, which is why so many traditions first defined the night, not by what it offered, but by what it threatened. And from that fear, whole systems of ritual emerged, each one a kind of psychological armor against what might arrive when the lamp went out. Night was never just the absence of light. It was a predator in its own right, creeping into houses, pressing against the cracks of walls, settling into bones. In pre-industrial times, darkness wasn't diluted by city glow or rescued by bedside lamps. Once the sun dropped, the world belonged to everything humans couldn't quite see, which is to say, most of it. The human imagination, already prone to suspicion, did the rest. Shadows weren't neutral, they were inhabited. The rustle at the edge of the hut wasn't just wind, it was a spirit passing by. The stillness inside wasn't silence, it was a pressure, a waiting. To fall asleep in that atmosphere wasn't relaxation, it was a gamble, the mind trying to rest while still convinced it might be devoured at any moment. Predators made the fear practical. Wolves in Europe, big cats in Africa, bears in North America all hunted at night. The vulnerable silence of the sleeping body only sharpened awareness that, outside the walls, teeth and claws were moving. Even domesticated animals sensed it. Dogs barked at nothing, cows shifted uneasily, chickens froze. Night was the theater of the hunt, and humans were never entirely exempt from the casting list. But beyond predators lay something worse, the supernatural. Cultures from Ireland to India carried stories of beings that prowled bedrooms after dark. In Europe, the mayor of nightmare fame pressed down on chests, choking sleepers into paralysis. In Islamic traditions, jinn slipped into homes, whispering into dreams or stealing breath. In African folklore, witches rode at night, their work invisible, but their effects felt in fevers and stillbirths by morning. The night wasn't only cold, it was inhabited, crowded, thick with company no one had invited. And then there was the simple fact of mortality. Sudden death in sleep was always most terrifying at night, when it seemed less like chance and more like visitation. Infants gone by morning, elders who failed to wake, whole households smothered by smoke from an untended fire. These tragedies didn't read as accidents. They read as proof that the night had claimed another. To live through it required not just good luck, but proper defenses. A lamp kept lit, a prayer whispered, a charm hung above the bed. The eerie part is how universally the night produced ritual responses. It wasn't one culture or one region. Everywhere, darkness became a test of ingenuity. In India, mantras were recited to protect the soul during sleep. In Catholic Europe, crosses were traced before lying down. In West Africa, iron blades or charms were kept near the body, sharp objects meant to cut through unseen threats. The rituals differed, but the fear that powered them was the same. Night was not empty. It was crowded with forces that eyed sleeping humans the way humans eyed livestock. Even architecture acknowledged this fear. Longhouses clustered families under one roof, not just for warmth but for the reassurance of numbers. Box beds with sliding doors doubled as miniature fortresses. Igloos narrowed at the entrance like funnels, designed not only for insulation but also as bottlenecks against whatever else might crawl in. The night was always out there. The trick was to convince yourself it could be kept at bay. And so every bedtime ritual, whether prayer, flame, or talisman, was less about comfort than about negotiating with darkness. The body needed rest, but the mind needed armor. And the most enduring form of armor was light, that fragile little flame that stood between the sleeping human and the waiting dark. If the night was an adversary, then fire was the treaty that made coexistence possible. A small flame at the edge of the darkness promised that the world hadn't vanished completely, that shadows could still be pushed back an inch at a time. To let a fire die at night wasn't just negligence, it was betrayal, an invitation to both cold and spirits. In Europe, the hearth wasn't only for cooking, it was a spiritual anchor. Embers were carefully banked under ash before families lay down to sleep, the glowing heart preserved until morning. Banking the fire was part of the nightly liturgy. Without it, the house was more than cold, it was unguarded. A living ember meant life itself, a sign that the household's breath still had a pulse even while its bodies slept. In Arctic igloos, warmth came from seal oil lamps, shallow stone bowls with wicks of moss or sinew. They burned with more smoke than flame, yet their glow softened the icy walls, transforming snow into a temporary sanctuary. Families slept under their flicker, trusting that the lamp's steady flame was not only warmth, but ward against the indifferent blackness outside. And across Asia, lamps and candles performed a similar double duty. In India, oil lamps were lit at dusk, both as offering to gods and as nightly defense. Light kept away insects, yes, but also malevolent beings believed to hover around sleepers. In Buddhist traditions, lamps flickering before shrines extended their protective glow across the household, sanctifying the night itself. Even Christianity folded the flame into ritual. Candles lit at bedtime symbolized divine presence, their burning considered prayer in wax form. A candle in the window could mark safe passage for souls or ward off those that wandered too close. The flame was not decoration. It was spiritual insurance, its tremble standing in for a watchman who never slept. And where fuel was scarce, the ingenuity was telling. In rural Africa, dried reeds or dung could be lit to smolder faintly through the night, just enough to maintain the impression of fire. The flame didn't have to be strong, it only had to exist. Even the smallest ember suggested continuity, as though the family had an ally among the elements, guarding the threshold between wakefulness and whatever prowled the dark. The symbolism was so deep that extinguishing a light at the wrong time became taboo. To snuff out a hearth before bed risked inviting misfortune. Fires were allowed to die only with ritual, prayers muttered, or ashes marked with protective signs. An empty, cold hearth was more than uncomfortable. It was spiritually obscene, a silenced absolute for humans to trust. But the real genius lay in how these fires shaped space. A circle of light defined the safe zone. Bodies pressed together just inside its radius, walls casting back the glow, the outside reduced to suggestion. Inside that circle, life continued, stories whispered, prayers murmured, children lulled by flicker. Beyond it, darkness remained hostile, unknowable. So the flame was more than survival tool. It was nightly proof that the household hadn't surrendered. As long as it burned, however faintly, there was continuity between day and night, life and death, safety and the abyss. The flame was frail, unreliable, often smoky and choking, but to sleep without it was to admit that darkness had won. And alongside the flame came words. Because what light couldn't guard against directly, language could, spoken prayers, chants, and blessings woven into the silence like invisible walls around the sleeper. If fire was the shield, then words were the locks. Spoken at the edge of sleep, they turned fragile flesh into something less permeable, at least for the hours when the body lay useless. A whispered phrase, a chant repeated until rhythm itself dulled the mind. These weren't embellishments. They were armor stitched out of syllables. In medieval Europe, children grew up reciting prayers that could double as death preparations. If I should die before I wake was not morbid poetry, it was statistical realism. Illness struck hardest at night. Houses burned most often while families slept. And sudden death in bed was common enough that preparing the soul became nightly habit. Words, muttered into darkness, were passports ready in case the sleeper failed to rise again. Islamic households followed the same logic with different verses. Before lying down, Quranic recitations and dua were performed, protective formulas wrapping the sleeper in divine oversight. The body surrendered to slumber, but the words carried vigilance where the flesh could not. In Hindu traditions, Vedic mantras were repeated before bed, meant to steady the breath, cleanse the mind, and guard against spirits that prowled thresholds. Language was more than expression, it was weaponized against the invisible. Even lullabies carried this duality. Soft melodies hummed to infants weren't simply about coaxing sleep, they were coded incantations. The repetitive tones soothed, but they also bound. In many African traditions, lullabies carried protective names of ancestors, whispered so the child would be recognized by benevolent spirits and ignored by malicious ones. To sing was to declare ownership of the sleeping body, reminding the night that it was not unclaimed prey. And then there were chants, not meant to comfort but to command. Shamans, in Siberia, for example, performed night songs to guide dreams, ensuring the soul wandered in safe territories. In Polynesia, prayers framed the dream world as navigable sea, with chants steering the spirit through. The words weren't metaphor, they were map, fence, and compass at once. But the logic remained strikingly similar everywhere. Silence was dangerous. To go to bed without speaking, humming, blessing, or chanting left a kind of void, a vacancy that the night could fill with whatever it pleased. Words weren't only sound, they were occupation. filled the air with rhythm and prayer, and there was less room for nightmares to seep in. And sometimes, the words weren't even meant for gods. In parts of Europe, charms and blessings were muttered to the bed itself, to the fire, to the walls. Anything that stood between the sleeper and the night was treated as an ally worth addressing. "Keep me safe," they whispered to stone, to straw, to the last ember glowing. Every object became conscripted into the defense, rallied through the simple power of being spoken to. Of course, faith in words was fragile. Forgetting a line, stumbling over a phrase, nodding off before finishing any lapse, could be read as opening the door. That's why ritual became rigid. Prayers drilled into memory until they could be repeated half asleep, lips moving automatically even as the body already sagged into dreams. Habit itself became protective, as though the night could be convinced by repetition alone. But words didn't always stand alone. They worked in chorus with objects, charms, and amulets laid carefully by the bed. Small anchors of protection that kept their silent vigil long after the tongue had gone slack with sleep. If words were fragile, objects promised permanence. A prayer could falter in the mouth, but a charm didn't forget. It sat there, heavy and stubborn, through the long hours when the body couldn't defend itself. Across cultures, the sleeping place was ringed with these silent guardians, half practical, half absurd, and fully serious. In medieval Europe, iron was the preferred ally. Knives slipped under pillows, scissors left open on windowsills, horseshoes nailed above doors. Sharp metal had the reputation of cutting through spirits as effectively as it cut through bread. The logic was blunt. If witches could fly, let them try landing on a blade. A child might drift off to sleep listening to the faint clink of shears under the mattress, comforted by the knowledge that steel stood guard against nightmares. In African traditions, protective charms were stitched into pouches, strung around necks, or placed at the corners of beds. They held herbs, bone fragments, or written verses, each item calibrated to keep away wandering forces. The bed was less furniture than ritual site, its perimeter marked with offerings to ancestors or wards against jealousy and malice. To sleep unprotected was to leave the soul unlocked, like a door swinging open into the street. The Americas, too, wove objects into their defenses. The dream catcher, now mass-produced and stripped of context, was originally hung above cradles in Ojibwe households. Its web caught intrusive nightmares, allowing only the good dreams to drip down like dew into the sleeper's mind. At dawn, sunlight burned away whatever the web had trapped, a tidy recycling of nocturnal refuse. The object worked not by brute force but by filtration, a delicate sieve against the chaos of the night. And then there were objects so ordinary they became extraordinary by placement. In parts of the Middle East, a bowl of water was set by the bed to absorb wandering spirits. In China, mirrors were positioned to reflect demons back into the dark, as though evil itself could be fooled by its own reflection. In Slavic households, bread or salt might be tucked under pillows, the staple foods transformed into night watchmen by sheer ritual insistence. Of course, the absurdity is part of the charm. Two modernized knives under pillows sound like a recipe for injury, and bowls of water seem more likely to drown bedbugs than demons. But the point wasn't practicality, it was control. The sleeper, powerless in the dark, needed proof that they hadn't surrendered completely. Objects provided that illusion, standing in as proxies, stationed like guards around a monarch too fragile to stay awake. Even infants weren't exempt. In many cultures, protective items were fastened directly to cradles, strings of garlic, sprigs of rue, carved figures glaring down at imagined threats. Babies, after all, were considered the easiest targets for spirits, their souls still soft and easily tugged away. To tuck a child in without charms was almost unthinkable. Protection had to be visible, tangible, and, ideally, a little intimidating. Yet amulets rarely stood alone. They were part of a larger scene, fire glowing faintly, prayers muttered into shadows, and families pressed together under quilts or hides. The objects weren't merely protective, they were symbolic, reminders that even in unconsciousness, humans could organize allies, recruit tools, and declare territory against the dark. And once the bed was ringed with its army of iron, herbs, webs, and mirrors, the night itself softened. Within that perimeter, sleep could finally claim the body. And it was in that collective body, pressed together for warmth and whispered stories. That night, rituals extended beyond protection into something more: shared identity. spoken into existence just before the eyelids closed. A bed, in the modern sense, is private property. One person, maybe two, a place marked off by invisible walls of personal space. But for most of human history, the bed was a commons. It was noisy, crowded, and smelled like a barn. And that was the point. The social bed wasn't simply for rest. It was the stage for nightly ritual, where warmth, safety, and identity were rehearsed before sleep. In Europe's longhouses and cottages, families slept together on straw pallets, limbs tangled, snoring overlapping, the occasional pig or chicken sharing space near the fire. It wasn't an accident or a lack of imagination. To sleep apart would have been inefficient, even dangerous. Children pressed between parents kept from freezing. Elders cushioned against drafts, and every shared breath raised the room's temperature slightly. The body wasn't private, it was infrastructure. But the shared bed was more than thermal engineering. It was a classroom. Before the embers dimmed, stories were told, genealogies recited, legends retold, gossip exchanged. The dark became an archive, and the bed was its library. Oral traditions relied on these nightly exchanges, whispered across generations. A child drifting off to sleep in a crowded bed learned not only the warmth of bodies but also the shape of history, absorbed in fragments of song, myth, and proverb. Elsewhere, the social bed played similar roles. Among indigenous families of the Americas, sleeping mats became spaces for storytelling, dream sharing, and prayer. The darkness was never silent. It was punctuated by the hum of memory, the recitation of names, the rehearsal of rituals. In Japan, futons laid across tatami floors formed neat grids of family order, with placement reinforcing hierarchy, elders at the center, children at the edges. Even in silence, the bed encoded social maps, each body a coordinate in the geometry of kinship. And then there was intimacy, not the romantic kind, but the intimacy of unavoidable proximity. A cough, a twitch, the shifting of weight all became shared events. Privacy was a luxury no one had thought to invent, and the night trained people to live as a collective organism. Fear of the dark dissolved when bodies pressed together into one breathing, murmuring mass. To be alone at night was terrifying. To be touched on all sides by kin was survival. The strangeness is how ritualized this became. The arrangement of bodies followed unwritten codes. Infants near mothers, elders away from drafts, siblings in rows, honored guests given prime spots. Placement wasn't random. It was as deliberate as any altar arrangement. To sleep in the wrong place could signal insult or demotion. To share a bed was to participate in the politics of proximity. And within that crowded space, rituals unfolded. Lullabies whispered, protective charms hung above, prayers recited in unison. The bed wasn't passive, it was sacred ground. It held warmth, yes, but also memory, hierarchy, and faith. By the time eyelids closed, sleep had been reframed, not as solitary retreat, but as collective survival. The body cocooned, not just in furs, but in social meaning. And when dreams came, they were never entirely private either. Morning rituals included retelling them, interpreting signs, weaving the night's visions back into the fabric of the group. Sleep didn't isolate. It expanded the household's shared narrative. But if the social bed framed the night as continuity, dreams themselves threatened to dissolve it. They were never just private fantasies. They were understood as portals, crossings into other worlds where ancestors, gods, or demons could intrude without knocking. Sleep may have closed the eyes, but it didn't close the world. For most societies, dreams weren't internal, they were excursions. The body stayed put, curled against kin or hearth, but the soul wandered, slipping through cracks the waking mind couldn't reach. To dream was to travel, and like all travel, it came with risks, guides, and border patrol. Ancient Egyptians treated dreams like telegrams from the divine. They even wrote manuals for interpreting them, lists of omens so specific it's almost comical. Dream of eating crocodile flesh, prosperity. Dream of being bitten by a donkey, bad luck. Nothing was random. The dream was a dispatch, a coded message, and failing to decode it properly could mean misfortune spilling into the day. In Mesopotamia, the connection ran deeper. Dreams weren't just messages but literal arenas where gods and spirits acted out their will. To misinterpret a dream was to misunderstand divine politics, and scribes worked overtime cataloging them. Clay tablets became night diaries, preserving visions that seemed trivial but were believed to anchor cosmic order. The night wasn't private, it was correspondence with eternity. For indigenous peoples across the Americas, dreams carried even greater weight. Among the Iroquois, for instance, dreams were considered expressions of the soul's desires. Ignoring a dream could sicken the dreamer. Fulfilling it could restore balance. Rituals were devised to enact dreams publicly, to prevent them from festering inside. The dream wasn't entertainment, it was obligation, a spiritual to-do list scrawled in images. And then there were dreamwalkers, shamans, who entered dreams not for themselves but for others. In Siberia, among the Ewenki, shamans were believed to travel in sleep, their spirits journeying into other realms to negotiate with gods or battle demons. Sleep wasn't downtime. It was another shift at work, the healer punching in at midnight to wander the corridors of another reality. Greek culture carried its own version, incubation temples, where the sick slept in sanctuaries, hoping for healing dreams from Asclepius, the god of medicine. Patients curled on sacred beds, their unconsciousness turned into medical consultation. The dream was both diagnosis and cure, written into the fabric of divine-human exchange. What united these practices was the refusal to see dreams as private fictions. They were real, external, invasive. The dream world was porous, and the sleeper was exposed. A pleasant vision might be a blessing, but a nightmare was evidence of intrusion. Spirits, witches, restless ancestors all could hijack the dream, steering it like a chariot. And once the dream ended, its residue lingered, needing ritual cleansing or interpretation. Morning conversations often revolved around these nocturnal adventures. Families huddled over embers, retelling the night's visions, passing their meanings. Dreams became communal property, their symbols folded into decisions about planting, marrying, or traveling. To ignore a dream was to risk ignoring the gods. To share it was to anchor oneself within the group's survival logic. But there was also terror in this arrangement. Dreams could reveal secrets no one wanted exposed, betray forbidden desires, or foretell doom no ritual could undo. To close one's eyes was to surrender not only to sleep, but to surveillance. Even unconsciousness had witnesses, and for every culture that revered dreams, there were also rituals to guard against their darker side, because if dreams opened portals, not everything that stepped through was welcome. Some nightmares weren't warnings, they were attacks. Not every dream was a message, some were invasions. Across cultures, people described the same uncanny sensation: the weight on the chest, the paralysis, the suffocating terror of being awake but unable to move. Today it's called sleep paralysis. For centuries, it was called a demon. In Europe, the culprit was the Maria malicious spirit that sat on sleepers, crushing them into helplessness. From this came the word nightmare, a reminder that the worst terror of the night wasn't galloping horses, but invisible visitors perched squarely on your ribcage. Victims described a heavy pressure, sometimes accompanied by visions of shadowy figures. The diagnosis wasn't medical, it was metaphysical. Something had come to feed. In West Africa, similar experiences were attributed to witches who traveled at night, riding victims in their sleep, leaving exhaustion and illness by morning. In Islamic traditions, the blame often fell on jinn, slipping into rooms, choking sleepers, whispering dread into ears. The Inuit spoke of spirits pressing down on chests, freezing bodies while souls wandered too far from home. Different names, same experience. The body held hostage while the mind flailed in the dark, and the attacks weren't always confined to the individual. Night terrors were thought to spread, afflicting whole households. A sudden spate of restless sleep, strange dreams, or unexplained illness could mark a community under siege. Ritual responses followed, charms renewed, prayers intensified, fires kept brighter, shamans summoned. The night was never left unchallenged. Every attack demanded countermeasures. Even infants weren't spared. Many traditions spoke of spirits stealing the breath of babies, slipping into cradles to smother the smallest and most vulnerable. In Europe, the belief in changeling spirits, swapping human infants for their own, folded into this terror. A restless child, a sudden death in the crib. These were explained not as medical tragedies but as supernatural theft. Families fought back with amulets, iron knives, even placing the baby between parents so their combined warmth and presence could deter spirits. The common thread was this: sleep exposed the body. With eyes closed, defenses down, the human became permeable. The sense of paralysis, the sensation of being watched, the sudden panic of immobility all confirmed the suspicion that sleep was not simply rest, it was vulnerability turned spectacle. Modern science points to neurological hiccups, REM sleep disruptions, and the brain's tendency to half-dream intruders into the room. But anthropology reminds us that the interpretations, however eerie, served a purpose. They gave names to the nameless terror, tools to resist it, rituals to reclaim a shred of control. A demon sitting on your chest may sound absurd, but it's less lonely than admitting your own brain betrayed you. And so charms hung heavier, prayers grew louder, and rituals multiplied. Night terrors weren't dismissed, they were met with counterattacks, layers of defense built until the household felt shielded again. To sleep was to risk assault. To perform the right ritual was to negotiate safety. But not all rituals were defensive. Some embraced the night, turning it into collective ceremony. Because while individuals feared spirits, communities found ways to transform the long hours of darkness into survival festivals, vigils, prayers, bonfires that turned night from enemy into ally. The night was never only a private matter. Entire communities treated darkness as a problem that needed collective management. When the days shortened, when cold seeped deeper, when predators seemed bolder, survival wasn't guaranteed by one person whispering a charm. It required the whole village to acknowledge that the hours after sunset were not neutral but charged, and therefore demanded ritual response. Winter, especially, sharpened this reality. In northern climates, nights stretched until morning became rumor. Long darkness made people restless, anxious, and vulnerable. So bonfires were built, not just for warmth, but to create circles of light, large enough to convince entire groups that they were not swallowed by the void. In Europe, solstice fires burned for hours, whole villages gathered, the sparks flung upward like tiny protests against the crushing night. In the Islamic world, Ramadan inverted the relationship between night and day. Darkness became sacred, filled with prayer, food, and communal gatherings. Instead of fear, the night turned into structure, a time when vulnerability was transformed into ritual discipline. Spiritual survival wasn't about resisting night, it was about sanctifying it. Elsewhere, vigils became defense strategies. In medieval Christianity, communities held night watches on holy days, staying awake together so no one was exposed alone. The very act of refusing to sleep became protective. If demons prowled, they would find the people gathered in prayer, not isolated in beds. A sleepless congregation was harder to haunt. Among nomadic peoples, the night was divided into shifts. One or two remained awake to guard fires, watch for predators, or chant protective songs while the rest slept. The rhythm of wakefulness rotated, ensuring the group was never fully surrendered to unconsciousness. Darkness was communal property, managed by rotation, parceled into watchful segments. And then there were the festivals, carnivals of inversion, where night's terrors were mocked, mimicked, or celebrated. Masks, dances, firelight, and processions blurred the line between humans and spirits, turning fear into theater. What had been dreaded at the edge of the bed became manageable when acted out in the street. Laughter, however uneasy, was itself ritual armor. Architecture reflected these collective responses to longhouses, yurts, igloos. They weren't just efficient shelters. They allowed groups to face the night together, their interiors humming with stories, songs, and small ceremonies. The community, pressed close, created its own horizon of safety. Darkness outside still prowled, but inside the circle, rituals turned survival into nightly routine. And yet, the communal rituals always acknowledged something humbling. No matter how many fires you lit, how many songs you sang, the night remained undefeated. It would always return, vast and silent. What humans built against it was never victory, only buffer. But in that buffer lay continuity, the reassurance that people weren't alone in their fragility. Because ultimately, the communal night rituals weren't just about fighting off spirits or predators. They were about transforming fear into rhythm, uncertainty into ceremony. To face the night alone was unbearable. To face it together was survivable. But modernity, with its private bedrooms and electric lights, stripped much of that communal scaffolding away. And yet the old instincts never vanished. Even today, the rituals survive in quieter, softer forms. Our lullabies, our nightlights, our whispered goodnights reminders that vulnerability in sleep still lingers, even if we pretend it doesn't. Electric light, insulated walls, and central heating were supposed to banish the night. Bedrooms fractured into private spaces, each person tucked into their own mattress, curtains pulled against a world that had been successfully conquered by switches and thermostats. And yet the rituals didn't die. They shrank, softened, disguised themselves, but they remained. Take the nightlight. A tiny bulb glowing in a child's room is no different in logic than an oil lamp burning in an ancient hut. It insists that the dark must never be absolute. Parents mutter reassurances, place stuffed animals by pillows, whisper bedtime stories. It looks modern, but the structure is ancient. Protection through light, words, and objects. The teddy bear is just a domesticated amulet, sewn plush instead of carved bone. Lullabies, too, linger. Parents still hum melodies older than memory, voices lowering into rhythms designed to tether a drifting mind. Science calls it soothing. Anthropology knows better. It's ritual. A parent's voice is a charm, staking claim over the child against whatever waits in the dark. The same impulse that once strung garlic over cradles now loops mobiles of smiling moons. The aesthetic changed. The logic didn't. Adults aren't exempt. Prayer before bed, once a matter of eternal survival, continues in countless households. Now I lay me down to sleep has softened into ritual comfort, but the words echo centuries of whispered insurance policies against the night. Meditation apps, sleep podcasts, even the insistence on sleep hygiene, all are modern descendants of nightly rites. Ways of ordering the vulnerable passage between wakefulness and the dream world, and still, in moments of collapse, the old rituals reappear naked. During blackouts, families cluster into one room, huddle under blankets, light candles. In disasters, strangers share mats in gyms or shelters, the collective bed reconstituted by necessity. The instinct surfaces instantly, press together, keep fire, whisper stories, survive. Thousands of years of practice don't vanish because someone invented memory foam. Even architecture betrays continuity. The suburban house, with its glowing porch light left on for safety, performs the same symbolic gesture as the hearthfire did. It announces, this threshold is guarded. The night cannot claim it freely. Hotels tuck a Bible into drawers. Airplanes dim lights but never fully darken cabins. Hospitals keep monitors beeping into silence. Sleep is still treated as vulnerability, needing ritual scaffolding. But perhaps the most revealing continuity lies in dreams. Despite science, despite neurology, people still turn to books, horoscopes, and online forums to decode last night's visions. What does it mean that I dreamed of losing teeth? Carries the same urgency as an ancient Egyptian asking what it meant to eat crocodile flesh in sleep. The conviction that dreams are porous, that they leak messages from somewhere else, remains stubborn. So while modernity has privatized sleep, the rituals endure in miniature. A light left on, a whispered phrase, a stuffed toy, a cup of tea, a podcast telling stories in the dark, they all echo the ancient truth. Sleep is still a threshold, and thresholds demand ceremony. Because deep down, the human animal has never believed that closing the eyes is simple. The night hasn't changed, only the defenses have grown subtler, disguised as habits instead of lit. But the survival logic hums on. Guard the flame, tell the story, keep the charm nearby. Survival, even in slumber, is always ritual.